In the 1970s, our women stood up and took key learnings from the Indian Welfare Act and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Child Placement Principle was born. And I recognise those elders in the room who were at that pinnacle and moment in time. I believe we're in another one in WA, and that we can have a balanced set of options, and alongside our mainstream brothers and sisters in community organisations, we can be at the forefront of breaking those intergenerational cycles and creating freedom for our families and our children. I welcome Sarah, the Executive Director of the National Indian Child Welfare Association.
Well, Chamai, everyone. Good morning. I greet you in my traditional Alutiiq language. I'd like to recognize the traditional stewards of these lands and to acknowledge the elders past, present, and emerging. I'd like to thank all of the Indigenous people for being here today and to thank those of you who have come as our allies. My name again is Dr Kastelic. I'm Alutiiq. That's a linguistic and cultural group. There are 11 Alutiiq villages in Alaska, and my family is from the native village of Uzinki. I'm an enrolled citizen there, and that's a community of about 250 people. And so you probably didn't know this, but on your body you carry a map of Alaska, so you can look at the state of Alaska. This is the Aleutian chain, and Kodiak is near the top of the Aleutian chain. So in the summertime we have about 9,000 people who are on that island when the weather is really beautiful. And my family's from Spruce Island, which is about a 20-minute skiff ride from the Big Island. So that's where I'm from. And as I get started this morning, I just wanted to share with you that in my community, when we gather together to have important conversations, like conversations about our children and families, that we have the belief that the Creator has prepared the space, that the Creator has arranged all of the people who are in the room, that the people who are here are the exact right people to have this conversation, and that we shouldn't be concerned about the details or who's missing or if you misspeak, because we trust that the Creator has prepared all of that. And so I share that with you because it's part of how I feel comfortable about what I'm sharing, is just to trust that the Creator has arranged all of this. So I serve as the Executive Director of the National Indian Child Welfare Association. We've been around for about 35 years. And our organization was founded after the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act. So Will mentioned in 1978, we had a piece of legislation passed by Congress. It was proposed and advocated for by tribal leaders from across the country. At that point in time, there had been some studies that had been done that showed that 25 to 35% of all American Indian Alaska Native children, so a quarter to a third of all Native children, were removed from their homes, and that 85 to 95% of those kids were placed in non-Native homes. So it's really intentional removal with the goal of assimilation, take kids from their Native families and place them in non-Native homes. And so there was a great sense of urgency in our country. Tribal leaders came together and lobbied Congress, and that resulted in the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act. And I'll talk more about some of what that act requires in a few minutes. But for now, I just say that when tribes were finally recognized as having the authority as governments to meet the needs of their citizens, especially their children, they were eager to take on that responsibility. And so very quickly began looking for resources. How should we serve our families? How should our workers interact with families most effectively? What kinds of services do families need? How do we create those services? How do we fund those services? And so our organization emerged first just serving tribes in the northwest part of the country. We were a training institute initially, and then because there was no one else doing the kind of work that we were doing, over time there were increasing demands for us to be of support to different communities, and then we eventually became a national organization. Importantly, we're not a direct service organization, so we're a nonprofit membership organization. And our work is about building the capacity of American Indian and Alaska Native tribal governments to prevent child abuse and neglect, to build up the protective capacity within families and communities to prevent child abuse and neglect. So our point of intervention is working directly with tribal governments. We have an all-Indian board of directors. We have 18-member board and 2 youth board members. So within that 18, we have 2 spots reserved for young people, and I'll talk more about that towards the end of my presentation. We have about a $3.5 million annual budget. We have a staff of 25 people, and we're headquartered in Portland, Oregon, so near Seattle, Washington. Our mission is that we're dedicated to the well-being of American Indian and Alaska Native children, so that's a pretty broad mission that gives us a lot of space to move around and to try to do good things that ultimately produce better outcomes for Native children and families. One way we talk about our work is to talk about the buckets or types of work. So we have about 4 buckets of work. The first one is what we call information and training. So we host training institutes around the country to train workers who are engaging directly with families and kids. And we have about 30 different curricula. And we host an annual conference every April, which is Child Abuse Prevention Month in our country. And in April, when we host our conference, it travels around the country to different parts of the country. And we generally have about 1,200 folks that attend. And the majority of our attendees are tribal child welfare directors and frontline workers. And so we're very much focused on building the skill set and capacity of workers to serve their communities. So that's our first bucket. The second bucket is what we call community development. And what we mean by this is in-community experience. So in the US, we have 567 federally recognized tribes, and communities will invite us in to support them in trying to address issues in their community. And this looks different everywhere we go. Sometimes it's a brief engagement. Sometimes we're in community for a day or a couple days to do some training or help facilitate some meetings or convene. We do a lot of intergovernmental work, so helping the tribe bring together county or state workers and talking about how to improve services for families and kids. At other times, this is a much longer engagement. So sometimes we work with a community for 2 to 3 years on major systems change projects. And whether that's trying to organize tribal programs so that they work better together and better serve families, or whether that's bringing in other service providers to ensure good referrals and that families get all the services they need, even if the tribe themselves doesn't provide it. Or sometimes this looks like completely reorganizing the tribal child welfare system, sometimes to be more youth and family focused, other times to be have a much stronger foundation in culture and language. So it can be a whole variety of things, whatever the community deems as important, whatever work it is that they'd like to do. And they invite us to be partners and supports in that work. And later on, I'll talk a lot more about what that looks like. So that's the second bucket. The third bucket of work, and probably the work that we're best known for, is our government affairs and advocacy work. So we work primarily at the national level, and we've been very successful in bringing more resources to tribal communities to serve children and families. So in the last 20 years, we've brought about $3 billion in new resources to tribal communities. And our strategy there was largely around trying to open up existing funding streams. So there are lots of funding streams for social services, for children and family programs that tribes weren't eligible for. Only state or county governments could access them. And so a big part of our lobbying effort was working with Congress to add the word "and tribes," add those 2 words to lots of different legislation that ultimately meant that tribes were eligible for those funding streams. And so over the course of several decades, billions more dollars going to our communities to serve families and kids. And then the final bucket of work was research. So although we didn't start out with a lot of research capacity or the intent to do research, we very quickly learned that if we were going to be effective in our advocacy, whenever you go to Congress, they ask about the scope and magnitude of the problem you're talking about. So it's not enough to just tell compelling stories about the impact of policies on your community members, but you need the data. And so because our country, unfortunately, doesn't capture very good data about our population, we had to do that ourselves. So we developed a research capacity and To this day, we do secondary data analysis, so we look at existing data and pull out data related to our population, as well as conduct our own primary research. So in a lot of cases, we find that existing data is very deficit focused. It looks at all the things that are wrong with our communities. And so a lot of the work that we do is strengths oriented. It's really looking at what are the strengths in our families and our communities that we can build on to improve outcomes for kids. So research is the fourth bucket of work that we do. I think I'm going to turn now to talk a little bit about some of the things that I see in common between our countries. And so this is just some observations that I've drawn from what I've read in the national framework, in the third three-year action plan, in the Family Matters report. I had the opportunity to be at the SNAICC conference, so this is certainly not an exhaustive or comprehensive list, but just some of the things that I've picked up as I've tried to learn more about the situation here. So unfortunately, a lot of the things that we have in common are not very positive. But some of them are the lack of national awareness of the history of and contemporary child removal, the disproportionality and disparate access to services. So in my home state in Alaska, our child population, about almost 18% of our child population is American Indian Alaska Native, yet we represent over just about 47% of the children in out-of-home care in the state system. So like you, unfortunately, we have significant disproportionate representation of our kids in out-of-home care. There's a real lack of compliance in our country with what we call placement preferences or your child placement principle. There's a challenge around the recruitment of Indigenous carers for children. And there's a real range of capacity in tribes and Indigenous organizations to secure funding, to design and manage services, and to effectively serve families. So as I mentioned, 567 tribes, that's a huge number. And so there's significant diversity among them, whether it's the size of the community, how large their Aboriginal territory is, how many members they have, what their resource base looks like. And so there's significant diversity there in terms of tribes' ability to work with their families. In our country, as here, child welfare funding is biased towards removal and out-of-home care. So unfortunately, the resources come at the end after children are already removed instead of really building up the protective capacity of families and children. So in my country, more than 60% of child welfare funding is triggered post-removal. And an additional challenge around funding is that increasingly government is requiring the use of evidence-based practices in order to receive funding to provide services. And unfortunately, most of the programs that are on those lists of evidence-based practices are interventions that have never been used in our communities. There's zero evidence that they've worked with our communities. And so there's a real challenge around trying to make a case for culturally based programs in particular that we know work with our community, things that have been passed down for thousands of years as being effective ways of working with our families. And it seems to us that constitutes a pretty good evidence base, but a lot of that we have to work to translate into legitimate research base that shows that these services are effective. So we've come up with lots of creative ways to do that, but that is a challenge for our communities, is that many of the services that we know work are not eligible for funding until we do work to build up the evidence base to prove it to other people. And finally, another thing that we have in common is that tribes and Indigenous organizations have inadequate access to child welfare funding. So in our country, $14 billion a year of federal child welfare funding is allocated to state and tribal governments every year. So $14 billion comes from the federal government to states and tribes. Tribal governments receive less than 1% of that funding, so about $120 million a year, despite the fact that we're 2% of the US population and perhaps more importantly, have significantly high rates of risk factors in several areas that are related to child abuse and neglect. So the lack of access to adequate funding is also a challenge. With those things in common, some of the differences that I've picked up on, and I'm sure there are others, but some of the ones that I think are really substantial. In the US, our Constitution recognizes American Indian Alaska Native tribes as governments, with the authority and the responsibility to care for their citizens, including their children. So we're starting from a different place than you are in terms of the relationship with government and implications for resources, I think. In our country, tribes receive some federal resources directly. We're not eligible for all the same funding streams that states are, but for many of them, and increasingly so, we're eligible to receive those resources directly. The Indian Child Welfare Act that I mentioned earlier, that piece of legislation that was passed in 1978, has some really important protections for our children. One is that it requires that any time an Indian child comes into contact with the child welfare system, when there are child custody proceedings that are starting, that the tribe has to receive notice that the child is involved in a child custody proceeding. And so this sounds really good. It sounds really excellent that tribes should know when their kids are being involved in a proceeding like this. However, there are some real challenges around implementation, I would just say, both in terms of because of our history of child removal like yours, families actually knowing where their tribal government is, who they're connected to, being able to share that information so that tribes can be noticed in a good way. There are also real challenges around how states implement this requirement. So there are certainly cases where notice is provided, but it doesn't provide enough information for a tribe to even determine whether or not the parents or the child are members. So it's very common for things like parents' names to be spelled wrong, the birth date to be listed incorrectly. And so if you're going to your membership roll to try to determine, is this child a member eligible for membership, if you don't get the correct information on the front end, the outcome is not going to be very good. It really thwarts tribes' ability to inform states about whether those children are members or not. And then, of course, whether or not ICWA applies. So it's an important provision, but there are a lot of challenges around how it gets implemented, and so that tribes actually know that they have kids who are involved. And the next piece of ICWA, a really important part, is that tribes have the right to intervene in cases as a legal party. So where their children are involved, where their citizen children, their member children are involved in a child custody proceeding, the tribe has the right to be involved in the case, to intervene in the case. They also have the right to transfer the case to tribal court if they so choose. So as you can imagine, this is a significant advantage, being able to move the case into your own court. Unfortunately, because of resources, many tribes can't afford to do this. There are some tribes who do this for every single ICWA case that comes up. Some very well-resourced tribes, but the vast majority of tribes transfer only a portion of cases, and often tribes can't even afford to transfer cases that they are really concerned about, cases that they really care about, because resources are just such a significant issue. So again, it's an important protection. It sounds really good on paper, but in terms of implementation, there are some challenges there. The other piece, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, is that state agencies are required to provide what we call active efforts to prevent the removal of children from their homes, and if children are removed, to provide active efforts to reunify families. And so this is a really different standard than the kinds of services that are required to be provided in other child welfare cases. So there's a much higher standard for our children because of the history of removal, that there's intentional effort being made, that there's a more significant effort to try to keep our families together. So that's an important recognition in our country. And so there are a number of handouts, I think, as you came in. And so as I start to talk more in detail about some of our work, I'll refer to some of those handouts. So this is the bigger chunk of my presentation where I give some examples of the different kinds of work that we do. The first thing I want to talk more about is about how we work with states and tribes to implement the Indian Child Welfare Act effectively, especially given some really wonderful policy wins that happened at the end of the Obama administration and that were effective at the end of last year. So one of the pieces of paper over here is a framework called Touchstones of Hope, which is a framework for reconciliation in child welfare. It was authored by Cindy Blackstock, who many of you may know, as well as Terry Cross, who's the founding executive director of our organization, and other authors. And I think what's important in this work that we draw on in all of our intergovernmental relations work is the guiding principle. So there are a set of guiding principles about how we support reconciliation and child welfare and how we make systems better, more effective for Native families and children. And so the guiding values are self-determination, culture and language, using a holistic approach, ensuring that there are structural interventions, and non-discrimination. And so anytime we start systems change work, anytime we embark on reconciliation work between tribes and states, these are principles that we draw on. We think it's a really important foundation. Specifically with regard to the implementation of the Indian Child Welfare Act and the new regulations and guidelines that became effective in December of last year, there's new clarification around what active efforts actually looks like. So the active efforts language was in the 1978 law. It said, states, this is what you're required to do, but there is no clarity around what that looks like, what that means, what it entails. And so we had more than 30 years of case law where basically across the 50 states, the implementation is occurring in different ways, and tribes are pushing back about whether or not that constitutes active efforts. So finally, in 2015, the administration promulgated regulations that clarify for us what active efforts really looks like. And this is particularly important because one of the painful lessons that I hope you'll learn from us is that although our Indian Child Welfare Act has some really wonderful provisions, there are some big gaps. And one of the most significant gaps is that there are no enforcement provisions in the law. So although the law says states have to do this, tribes have to be noticed, tribes have the right to transfer cases, when those things don't happen, there's absolutely zero enforcement mechanism, either for the state or we have a significant problem actually with private adoption agencies and attorneys who are interested in adopting our children out to other families. And so the fact that our law has no teeth, that it has no enforcement provisions is a big problem, which is in part why these regulations were important, is because they at least are legally binding and provide a way for tribes to try to remedy when states aren't complying with these requirements. But I wanted to share with you just a little bit about active efforts because I think because in many ways, the kinds of services that our families receive before kids get removed and the kinds of services that are provided to try to reunify families, this is at the heart of whether kids are going to be in their own homes. This is really about whether kids can stay home or if they're removed, if there are going to be services and supports for their families that allow them to be reunified. So at least in my opinion, this is the real heart of the matter, whether or not families are receiving these kinds of supports and services that allow their kids to stay with them. So I would just talk very briefly about them, and there is a long list, which is really good for us. This provides a much clearer picture of what we're expecting states to do in interacting with our families, but it is a list of 11 things, and so I'll just mention these to you. So the first example of active efforts, which of course should be tailored to the specific facts and circumstances of any case, that the first example is conducting a comprehensive assessment of the circumstances of the Indian child's family, including family strengths, with a focus on safe reunification as the most desirable goal. So this is the expectation, this is the bar, that when states or counties are investigating, when they're coming in to engage with the family, that they need to make sure that there's an assessment that's done, and that it's a comprehensive assessment, and that it doesn't just include the things that are wrong, but that it also accounts for the strengths that the family and community can build on in trying to reconcile whatever challenges there are. The second example of active efforts is identifying appropriate services and helping families to overcome barriers, including actively assisting the parents in obtaining such services. So this isn't just giving a referral. This isn't just saying there's a parenting class offered here, or here's where you can go to get substance abuse treatment services, but it's engaging with the family. It's being in partnership with the family to really understand the barriers and to help the family overcome the barriers. There's this positive Indian parenting class. It's a culturally based program. Does that sound like something your family is interested in? Do you have transportation? Do you have childcare? They offer a meal. Can your partner go? It's really doing the troubleshooting. It's engaging with families to try to make sure that families can overcome barriers to receive the services they need. The third example of active efforts is identifying, notifying, and inviting representatives of the Indian child's tribe to participate in supporting services to the child's family, and to participate in family team meetings, in permanency planning, and in the resolution of placement issues. So it's inviting the tribe to be a partner in serving the family, because that tribe is going to have services, they're going to have resources the state or county doesn't have. And so the ability for the state or county to meet that family's needs is highly dependent on partnering with the tribe, who has the ability to marshal other services, other supports, to wrap around the family to help them build their protective capacity. So inviting the tribe in, that's a really important step. The fourth element is conducting a diligent search for the Indian child's extended family members and contacting and consulting with extended family members to provide family structure and to support the child and their parents. So this is another reason why you need the tribe. Who's going to know the family? Who's going to know the extended family? The tribe is. So they can help you find those family members. They can help you convene those family members. But making sure the family is involved is critical. The fifth element is offering and employing all available and culturally appropriate family preservation strategies and facilitating the use of remedial and rehabilitative services provided by the child's tribe. So explicitly making sure that whatever the tribe's got available is accessible to that family. The sixth step is taking steps to keep siblings together whenever possible. The seventh example, supporting regular visits with parents or Indian custodians, Indian carers, in the most natural setting possible, as well as trial home visits with the Indian child during any period of removal, consistent with the need to ensure the safety, health, and welfare of the child. So making sure that child has contact, making sure that they're meeting with their family in the most natural setting possible, and including trial home visits. The eighth element, identifying community resources, including housing, financial resources, transportation, mental health, substance abuse, and peer support services, and actively assisting the Indian child's parents in utilizing and accessing those resources. And this element, the regulations talk about the history here, that part of the forced removal of our children from their families and communities was because of how some of these basic needs weren't being met. That's one problem. Some of the basic needs weren't being met. Another problem is just the lack of recognition, the cultural bias of workers imposing their own view of what it looks like to meet some of these needs. So there are two different problems here, but in the regulations they talk about not having basic needs met means that you need to figure out how to meet the basic needs. That specifically because the history of removal for these kinds of issues, that this isn't acceptable. We want to make clear that this isn't acceptable anymore, that where basic needs aren't met, you need to figure out how to meet the basic needs so the child can stay at home. The 9th item is monitoring the progress and participation in services. So it's not enough to connect people to help them engage, but then you got to watch what happens. You got to figure out how it's going along and provide more support as families are trying to do what they need to do to keep their kids or to bring their kids back home. The 10th item is considering alternative ways to meet the needs of the Indian child's parents and, where appropriate, the family if the optimum services don't exist or are not available. So it's not enough to just say, geez, we know what they need, but it's not here, it's not available. But you've really got to be creative in working with a family and working with a tribe and working with other service providers to figure out how you connect the family to alternative services that are going to help meet their needs. The 10th item, the 11th item is providing post-reunification services and monitoring. So after families and kids are reunified, that's not the end of the story. We've got to make sure that services and supports are wrapped around that family to ensure that they can keep their child at home. So I know that was a long list to go through, but I think for us, at least in the States, it really helps to clarify significantly what the responsibility of state and county is to support Native families in protecting their children. And so the regulations not only spell this out clearly for us, what this looks like, but it also goes on to discuss how state agencies can document that they're following this, document what they're doing. And so it gives some suggestions about how that might look. That the agency should document what specific issues the family is facing and how the agency is targeting active efforts to address those challenges. So to be really explicit about what the challenges are, what's preventing that family from keeping their child at home, and then what you're doing, what the active efforts are that align with that to try to prevent the breakup of the family or to make sure that reunification happens. So the case file should include a list of active efforts the state agency determines would best address the issues that the family is facing. It should include dates, persons contacted, and other details showing how the state agency provided active efforts. So what is it you actually did? Who are you in touch with? What services? How are you interacting with the family, engaging with them in ways that helps them to access services? And then finally, what were the results of those active efforts? And where the results weren't satisfactory, how did the agency try to adjust the efforts to better address the issues that the family was facing? So this is really clear guidance, and as I mentioned in the SNAICC conference when I talked about this, we've even counseled state courts that essentially you can use these items here as a checklist. So when the agency comes before you to say, here's this Indian child, and we provided active efforts, the judge can ask, did you do this, and where's your evidence of that, and what does the case file show? But there's a really clear roadmap for what those expectations are, and so the judge can hold the agency accountable for providing the active efforts. So these regulations went into effect last December, mid-December, so we've been working with them for about 9 months now. And so we've already seen some really good examples of how states and tribes are coming together to try to implement these together in ways that benefit Native families. And so I thought I would just share a couple of examples. Clearly, since this is much more detail about how the policy should be implemented, there's a need for training. So for workers who are doing the work now, for new workers who are coming on, it's really important to provide good training, and where possible, to train tribal and state workers together, and where possible, to ensure that at least some part of this training actually happens in tribal community, so that workers have the context of connection, of being in a tribal community. And so this work is happening in a variety of states. In Oregon, Montana, and Washington, for example, they're doing worker training. In Washington State, we were actually contracted to help them write their new curriculum for the worker training, and then to deliver the first couple waves of training so that then their workers could take on the training. But that's happening in different places in the country, and that's a really important thing to making sure that there's consistent understanding about what the policy requires, and that tribes and states are working together to make sure that the best things happen for families. There are policy changes that are happening in different states. So in Oregon, where our organization is located, there are requirements to have a child welfare hearing to determine on the record whether or not the child is Indian. So if this is the whole hook, this is what triggers all the protections of the Indian Child Welfare Act. The question is the child Indian? The state of Oregon requires that determination to actually happen in court and for all of that to be on the record. So that's a policy change. And then in a number of places, there are court improvement activities that are happening. So tribes and states are working together to make sure that the implementation and the accountability that happens in the court system is on target. So a number of states, Montana, California, Colorado, and others, are really focused on the court aspect of this. So those are all good things for Indian families and kids. So beyond the federal law and implementing the federal law effectively, there are also opportunities for states to clarify, to apply, to extend the protections of ICWA in their own local context. And so there are a number of states in our country that have some kind of provision that acknowledges the Federal Indian Child Welfare Act, or that gives a context for how it's applied in the state. There are about 6 states that have really comprehensive state ICWA laws. So they've essentially taken the federal law and made it their own. They've clarified how things should be implemented. They have extended protections in the state of Washington, for example. The state ICWA law there goes beyond the federal ICWA, which says these protections apply to federally recognized tribes, to child members of federally recognized tribes. And in this case, in the state of Washington, they've said it doesn't matter if it's a federally recognized tribe. It doesn't matter if the child is a member of a state recognized tribe. It doesn't matter if the child is an indigenous child, but they're from a non-recognized tribe. The protections apply. So there have been ways that states have extended the protections, including in Washington, they consider children who are from First Nations. So there is really an ability at the state level to clarify, to apply the federal law in a local context, or to heighten the requirements, to heighten the protections, because the state feels that's important. So like I said, about 6 states have really comprehensive state ICWA laws, and from our opinion, some of the best ones are in Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So those are some of the newer laws for several decades now. A couple of states have been dabbling in this, and particularly in the last couple years, there have been some really solid state laws that give good protections for families. And so in a lot of those places, the role that we have is to work with coalitions that are trying to get legislation passed. We help to review drafts of legislation and do whatever we can to support testimony and other kinds of things to ensure that where states and tribes are working together, where advocates are mobilized to try to get these kinds of laws in place, that we're supportive of that. In some places, they don't perceive a need for that kind of legislation, or there may not be the political will to get something like that done. And so there are other places where there are agreements. There may not be legislation in place, but there are tribal state agreements. So in our country, 39 tribal state agreements on ICWA, and that involves 37 tribes and 10 states. And there was actually just a recent report in June of last year, an excellent analysis, 200-page analysis of these different agreements and the similarities and differences between them and some of the best practices there. So if anybody's interested in that, there's actually a lot of documentation around both the state ICWA laws and these agreements. And if you're considering anything like that, we have a lot more to share with you about that. So I think that's about what I wanted to say about ICWA. So I'm going to move on a little bit now, and I'm going to talk about some of the work that we do in different regions and with specific tribes to help build the capacity of the organization or the tribe to serve Native families and kids, and in particular with a lens for reducing disproportionality. So we use child welfare system decision points to examine disproportionality, and we use our relational worldview. There's some slides up here that look like colorful quadrants that say relational worldview, and so that's our technical assistance model. We look at the health and well-being of families, of individuals, of communities and organizations, according to the quadrants of that model. We're looking at what are the strengths and gaps in each of those areas, and importantly, from kind of a composite view of Native teachings, we're looking at what is the balance, where is the harmony between those different quadrants. And so as we do work around systems change and building capacity of tribes and organizations, we're really looking at that indigenous perspective of well-being and balance to try to inform what needs to change, what the tribe's priorities are, what they want to work on in order to build their capacity. So the project that I want to talk about now is, it has a funky name because it's named after a federal grant, and the federal grant was called the Western and Pacific Implementation Center Project. So we call it WIPIC. And I want to tell you about this project because I think gives us a chance to dive deep into what some of this work looks like on the ground and what role our organization as an outsider, we're not members of these communities, we're indigenous peoples, but we're coming in to support the community in change that they're trying to make. And so as outsiders, we see our roles as facilitators, as supporters, as consultants. We're bringing tools, we're bringing frameworks and ideas, but we firmly believe the solutions to the challenges, whatever they are already there in the community, and our job is to kind of organize and structure and frame things so that the community can determine their own answers. They can determine their own solutions to the problems, and our job is to support them in doing that. So this WIPIC project was a 5-year federally funded project. It was developed by a consortium of 16 tribal entities from across Alaska and with the Alaska Office of Children's Services. And the goal was to reduce the disproportionate placement of Alaska Native children in out-of-home care. So as I mentioned, in Alaska, we have some of the highest rates of disproportionality in our country. And because such a significant portion of the state population, about 20% of the state population, state adult population is Native, then there's some political will to try to do something about this. So that was one of the reasons that we were working in Alaska. And the goal of the project was to address the systemic issues that exist in tribal child welfare between the state, especially the Office of Children's Services, and Alaska Native tribes. So this required acknowledging and addressing decades of misunderstandings, mistrust, miscommunication between tribal and state child welfare programs and staff. So our project provided support to engage in courageous conversations for fostering mutual problem solving and to build leadership capacity to address the challenge of disproportionality. So what did this all look like? So based on our child welfare decision point data, so we have data that's broken out by region across Alaska, and we have those 16 different teams, the state and tribal partners from those regions, looking at the data from their region and saying, what's going to make the difference? What is going to reverse this trend? What's going to keep more kids out of home care? How do we keep people at home? What are the most important things that we can do? And so they decided on 3 strategies. So over this 5-year project, the 3 strategies that they thought would be most important in reducing disproportionate placement. First, increasing the tribal capacity to deliver in-home services. So tribes being able to serve families in their homes, to provide support and services there, would reduce the number of kids going into care. Increasing tribal capacity to license their own foster homes, especially relatives. That was another important piece of the puzzle for keeping more kids out of care. And then finally, enhancing the capacity of tribes to work effectively with the courts, which we thought would result in better decisions in ICWA cases, more in alignment with placement preferences that would keep more kids at home. So those were the 3 strategies. Tribal in-home services, licensing foster homes, especially relatives, and then building tribal capacity to be effective in court. And so those were the strategies that they settled on. I want to pause for just a minute to mention another important partner in this work. So one of our values is that because we're working to serve young people and children, that they need to be involved in our work, that they need to have an opportunity to help shape and guide the work, to say what matters and what should happen, especially in cases where we're trying to change systems to better serve them. So in this work in Alaska, we partnered with a youth-led organization, an organization of youth and care that was called Facing Foster Care in Alaska. And so we had a group of young people that partnered with us through this 5-year project. And their mantra to us was no conversations about us without us. If you're gonna talk about us, we should be in the room, we should be at the table, we should be helping to co-develop these solutions that you think are gonna be helpful for us. And so it was wonderful to work with these youth over 5 years. An important aspect of this work was youth actually training the adults. These are mostly service providers in the room, state and tribal service providers. But young people had to do some training with the adults about how to actually engage with them effectively. So in our country, unfortunately, what passes as youth engagement, and not just in indigenous communities, but often what passes for youth engagement is, we're gonna hold this meeting, we should have a youth representative here, let's get somebody over here, who knows somebody who can come, and then it's barriers like, the meeting is during school hours, and no one thought about how this young person is gonna get there, and nobody reached out to them to help them understand what the meeting was about, and what decisions are getting made here, and what role, if any, they have. And so often we just don't do a very good job when we say we wanna engage with young people. It's not in an authentic or genuine way that actually allows for their participation. So in this project, we had young people train the adults about what's needed to effectively engage with them. So I'll say more about some of that in a few minutes. The young people also helped to facilitate the work plan for how this was all gonna happen. They were important stakeholders in making decisions about how the work would look and in facilitating the conversations and developing the work plans. And then I think importantly, we didn't just invite them to participate in our work. This is our agenda. Do you want to slot into what we're doing? But we actually felt it was important to support their agenda. So in talking with these young people, they had a really strong priority around trying to make sure that siblings stayed together when they went into out-of-home care. That was one of the most important things to these young people. And so we helped to support their agenda. So our project helped to train them around strategic sharing, and there's some handouts up here about strategic sharing, but what do you feel comfortable sharing about your lived experience, with whom, under what circumstances, how do things go on the record or not, what happens if you get triggered, what happens if somebody asks a question or something happens in that moment when you're telling your story. But we did a lot of work with them around strategic sharing. We helped them to lobby the legislature for a joint session of the state legislature where a number of these young people shared and directly called on the legislature to pass a bill that would require keeping siblings together. And so the young people did this work and they got their bill. But we felt like not only is that good for our project, but it's good for us when we're partnering with people, not to just invite them into our agenda, but again, to try to support what their priorities are, because we feel like that's a representation of true partnership. So that was a really good experience for us. Our project provided training, technical assistance, and consultation to support the initiative, so to support the State Office of Children's Services and those 16 tribal partners in coming together. We assisted in helping the tribes to assess their own capacity in the 3 strategies. So if we have 3 strategies that we're working towards: tribal in-home services, licensure of foster homes, especially relatives, and being effective in state court, how are we doing at the beginning? What's our baseline? How comfortable are tribes with these things? What kind of capacity do they have? But that assessment at the beginning. We facilitated development of tribally defined standards for in-home services. So we brought the tribes together, really diverse communities from across the state. The state of Alaska is about 1/5 the size of the rest of the United States. So Alaska is as big as Texas, California, Montana, plus most of the East Coast combined. So we have really large landmass, really diverse tribal communities, 260 tribal communities there. So there's a really diverse group of folks, and bringing those communities together to say, what are our standards? Where's the line in the sand? What are in-home services going to look like, and what standards do we have to meet in order to keep kids safe and to support families? So that was really an important step. We developed a template for in-home services systems of care planning. So this is another one of the handouts up here. And so what we learned in this project was one of our important roles as outsiders was actually to help the tribes in the state talk to each other in ways that help the state to recognize what the tribes were already doing, what strengths and capacity they already had, and in some ways to develop a language and framework that that gave those things more legitimacy, that gave them credibility in the eyes of the state, so the state would actually have more confidence in what tribes were doing and would be willing to refer families to tribal services instead of just removing kids, which is what the state primarily did. And so being able to translate between those couple things was really important. We helped to provide intensive tribally based technical assistance in 5 sites. So in 5 places, we went really deep and over multiple years worked with the community to build their capacity around delivering services, developing strategies for funding and for referral protocols, those kinds of things. We also conducted peer-to-peer learning events, leadership academies, judicial institutes, as well as local training and coaching activities. We used a data dashboard over that 5-year period. We were looking at the data at those decision points to see what difference our interventions were making. And we developed and implemented protocols for monitoring that the state was actually referring families to tribal in-home services. So we were trying to hold them, and they were happy to be held accountable, but that was part of the agreement. We need to make sure that if we're building all this infrastructure, that the referrals are actually happening. And then finally, we facilitated courageous conversations on race relations, decolonization, unconscious bias, and access to funding. So the whole other level of work that had to be done interpersonally, helping people address some of these challenging issues. So I think that's the end of my time here. And I really look forward to sharing with you all on the panel and talking with you after this. Thank you. Thank you, Will.